Be honest. You can't even watch this video without wanting to check your phone. Not because you're busy, not because you have important messages, but because your brain has been trained to panic the second nothing is happening. Silence feels uncomfortable. Focus feels exhausting. Boredom feels unbearable. And if that sounds like you don't have bad habits. You have years of brain rot. You open your phone without deciding to. You are in the middle of a conversation and your mind drifts somewhere else. You sit down to do something that matters, and within 2 minutes you are somewhere completely different. You finish a video and immediately start another one. Not because you wanted to, but because stopping felt strangely uncomfortable. And at some point, you began to notice something unsettling. The things that used to hold your attention no longer do. Books feel slow. Long videos feel like an effort. A conversation without a notification in the background starts to feel slightly restless. Even silence has started to feel like something is missing. And maybe the strangest part, you know something is wrong. You have probably already tried to fix it. You deleted the apps. You set screen time limits. You went a few days without scrolling. And for a short while, it helped. But then something quiet happened. You came back. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, almost invisibly. The old patterns returned. And now you are back in the same place, wondering why you cannot seem to hold your own attention, wondering why your mind feels scattered, even when nothing around you is demanding it, wondering whether years of this have done something to you that cannot simply be undone. Most people call this brain rot, and they say it half-jokingly, but underneath the joke is a real fear. That something about the way they think has fundamentally changed. That the version of themselves who could sit with a thought, follow an idea, feel genuine boredom without panic, is slowly disappearing, and no one is quite sure how to get it back. This video is about that, not about quitting your phone, not about a 30-day detox, not about becoming someone who wakes up at 5 a.m. and reads philosophy before breakfast. This is about understanding what is actually happening inside your brain, why the usual fixes keep failing, and what actually works. Because once you understand the real mechanism behind brain rot, something interesting happens. You stop fighting yourself, and you start working with what is actually there. But to get there, we first need to talk about something most people completely misunderstand: what brain rot actually is. When people hear the phrase brain rot, they usually imagine it as a content problem. Too much social media, too many short videos, too much low-quality entertainment. And the obvious solution seems to follow directly from that. Stop consuming bad content. Replace it with better content. Read more books. Watch more documentaries. And your brain will recover. But here is where the understanding breaks down. Because brain rot is not primarily a content problem. It is an attention problem. And the difference between those two things changes everything about how you fix it. Think about what actually happens when you spend months or years consuming content in short, fast, instantly rewarding bursts. Every video is designed to hook you in the first 2 seconds. Every scroll delivers something new before you have processed what came before. Every notification promises that something important is waiting for you right now. Your brain is not passively watching this happen. Your brain is learning from it. And this is where it gets important to understand something about how the brain actually works. Your brain has a system that decides what deserves attention. It is not random. It is trained. Every time you experience something that delivers a fast reward, your brain registers that pattern. Fast input, fast reward, and it begins to optimize for it. Not as a moral choice, not as a character flaw, but as a biological adaptation. Your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. It is learning from repetition. It is saying, this is what the world looks like, so this is what I should be built for. And after thousands of repetitions of fast, stimulating, instantly satisfying input, your brain begins to recalibrate. Its threshold for what counts as interesting rises. Its tolerance for slowness falls. Its ability to sit with something that takes time to unfold, something that requires patience before it delivers meaning, begins to erode. This is not you being lazy. This is not you being weak. This is your brain doing its job. It adapted to the environment you gave it. The problem is that the environment you gave it was not designed for your benefit. It was designed to capture and hold attention as efficiently as possible. And your brain, not knowing the difference, adapted accordingly. So when people say their brain feels fried, or that they cannot focus like they used to, what they are describing is real. The wiring has genuinely changed. Not permanently, not irreversibly, but it has changed. And understanding that is the first important shift in this conversation. Because if brain rot were just a habit, you could break it the way you break habits. But if it is a wiring problem, you need a different kind of solution. And before we get to that solution, there is something else you need to understand. Something that explains why the most popular fix for brain rot keeps failing the people who try it. Digital detox has become the standard answer to brain rot, and it makes intuitive sense. If the problem is too much screen time, the solution is less screen time. Step away, clear your head, give your brain some silence. And this is not wrong. A period of reduced stimulation does help. The noise quiets down. You start to feel some clarity returning. After a few days without constant scrolling, things that felt dull begin to feel slightly more interesting again. So in that way, detox works, but it is incomplete. And the reason it is incomplete reveals something important about the nature of this problem. When you stop consuming short-form content, your brain does not reset to factory settings. It does not return to some clean baseline it had before. It sits. With the wiring it already has. With the reward thresholds that were raised. With the hunger for stimulation that was built through thousands of repetitions. And it waits. So after a few days or a few weeks, when the structure of the detox loosens even slightly, something happens. The brain finds its way back. Not because you are weak, not because you lack discipline, but because the wiring is still there. The pathway is still wide open. And when the environment returns, even partially to what it was, the brain follows the path it already knows. This is why so many people describe the same experience after a digital detox. They feel better for a while. They feel clear, even proud. And then slowly, almost quietly, they find themselves back in the same patterns. The apps return. The scrolling returns. The inability to sit still returns. And this time, there is an added layer of frustration because they tried. They did the hard thing, and it still didn't hold. That experience drives people into a spiral that is worth naming, because it is not just discouraging, it is quietly destructive. Here is how the spiral works. You notice that your attention is fragmented. You recognize that something has changed about the way your mind feels. You try a detox. It helps, temporarily. You return to old patterns. You feel worse than before, because now you know the problem, and still could not fix it. So you begin to believe the problem is you, not the mechanism, not the wiring, but you, your weakness, your inability to change, your fundamental lack of self-control. And once that belief takes root, something dangerous happens. You stop looking for a better solution, because you have already decided that no solution will work for someone like you. That spiral is where a lot of people get stuck. Not for a week, but for years, moving between brief moments of clarity and long stretches of the same patterns, growing slightly more convinced each time that this is just who they are now. But that conclusion is wrong, and understanding why it is wrong requires understanding something that most detox advice never addresses. The fact that this particular problem is unlike almost every other addiction or habit that people try to break. Most addictions, most destructive habits, share a common feature. They exist separately from normal life. Alcohol is not a necessary part of your day. Cigarettes are not built into your work routine. Gambling does not come pre-installed on your phone with a red notification badge, which means when someone is trying to break those habits, the strategy of removal is genuinely viable. You remove the substance. You restructure the environment. You build distance between yourself and the thing that was harming you. And with time and support, that distance becomes recovery. But brain rot does not work like that, because the thing that caused it is not separate from your life. It is woven into it. Your phone is also your alarm clock, your maps, your way of staying in contact with people you love, your method of doing work, sending messages, organizing your schedule. The platform that rotted your attention is the same platform where your friends share important news. The app that fragments your focus is the same one you need to coordinate your day. You cannot simply remove it the way you remove a bottle from a cabinet. It is embedded. And this creates a problem that cold turkey solutions cannot fully solve. You can white-knuckle your way through a week without social media, but you will eventually return to the same environments, the same feeds, the same architecture of infinite scroll and algorithmic recommendation. And when you do, if all you did was step away for a while without changing anything fundamental about your relationship to it, the wiring picks up exactly where it left off. Because the pathway was never closed. It was just temporarily unused. This is why the long-term strategy has to be something different. Not avoidance, not willpower. Something that works with the wiring instead of trying to overpower it. And to understand what that strategy looks like, we first need to go a little deeper into what is actually happening inside the brain during all of this. Because once you see the mechanism clearly, the solution becomes almost obvious. Your brain runs on a system called dopamine. You have probably heard this word, but the way most people understand it is slightly off. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. Dopamine is the anticipation chemical. It is not released when you get the reward. It is released in the moment before, when your brain predicts that a reward is coming. This is an important distinction, because it means the drive to keep scrolling is not about enjoying what you are seeing. It is about the anticipation of what might come next. The slot machine pull, the next video, the next notification. Your brain releases dopamine, not because the content was satisfying, but because more content might be. And with every pull of the feed, every swipe, every tap, that loop reinforces itself. Your brain learns that this behavior predicts reward, so it begins to crave the behavior, not just the content. The act of scrolling itself becomes associated with the feeling of anticipation, and anticipation, for the brain, feels almost indistinguishable from satisfaction. Now here is where the long-term damage happens. When this cycle repeats thousands of times, your brain begins adjusting its baseline. In neuroscience, this is called downregulation. When a system is overstimulated repeatedly, the brain reduces its sensitivity to it. It is trying to maintain balance. So if you are constantly flooding your brain with small dopamine hits, your brain pulls back. It lowers the receptors. It raises the threshold. Now, ordinary things Things that used to feel meaningful or interesting no longer register the same way. A conversation with someone you care about feels less engaging. A slow, developing idea feels harder to track. A piece of music you once loved doesn't quite land the way it did. Not because those things changed, but because your brain's ability to feel satisfied by them has been dampened. This is the real cost of brain rot. Not just distraction, not just wasted time, but a reduced capacity to feel richly about ordinary life. And this is why people who have been in these patterns for a long time describe a particular emptiness. They scroll for an hour and feel worse after. They finish a video and feel nothing. They are constantly consuming and chronically understimulated at the same time, because the brain has been raised to a level that ordinary experience can no longer reach. Now here is the part that changes everything. That threshold is not fixed. The wiring is not permanent. The brain that adapted in one direction can adapt in the other, not instantly, but reliably. And the mechanism that rotted the brain is the same mechanism that can repair it. Repetition. This is the core of what most brain rot advice misses. The brain did not deteriorate randomly. It changed because of a consistent pattern of behavior, repeated over a long period of time. Every scroll was a repetition. Every swipe was a repetition. Every time you picked up the phone without deciding to, you reinforced a pathway. Not dramatically, not obviously, but steadily. And those small repetitions, accumulated across months and years, reshaped how your brain allocates attention. Which means the solution is not to undo the repetition. That is impossible. The solution is to begin a new pattern of repetition, to redirect the wiring. Not erase it, redirect it. Because the same brain that learned to crave instant stimulation can learn to tolerate and eventually prefer something slower. Not through willpower, not through discipline alone, but through consistent, repeated exposure to a different kind of input. Think about what happens inside the brain when this begins. Each time you choose to sit with something that requires more of you, a long video, a chapter of a book, a conversation that goes deeper than usual, your brain is running a slightly unfamiliar process. It is reaching for a reward that is not immediately obvious. At first, this feels uncomfortable because the old wiring is still active. It is still saying, "This is slow, switch to something faster." But when you stay anyway, something important happens at the neurological level. The neural pathway associated with sustained attention gets used, and like any pathway that gets used, it gets slightly stronger. Not dramatically, not overnight, but each time you repeat it, it reinforces. This is neuroplasticity, not a motivational buzzword, a real, documented biological process. Your brain physically changes its structure based on how you use it. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Which means every single time you choose to stay with something slow, every time you resist the reflex to switch, every time you let the discomfort of waiting exist without immediately solving it with your phone, you are laying down new wiring. It is invisible, it is quiet, but it is cumulative. And this is where the mindset shift has to happen, because most people approach this problem thinking about it in large terms. I need to fix my attention. I need to get my focus back. I need to become someone who reads again. But that framing makes the goal feel distant. The actual unit of change is not a day. It is not a week. It is a moment. A single micro decision. The pause before picking up your phone. The choice to stay with one more paragraph when your brain is pulling you away. The moment you notice a reflex before it executes. These are not small things. They are exactly the repetitions that change the brain. And this understanding changes how you feel about every small decision you make. Because every single one is pointing the brain in a direction. Every choice is either reinforcing the old wiring or building the new. Every moment is a vote. But here is the part that requires honesty. Most of those moments happen without you noticing them. That is the quiet difficulty at the center of this problem. Brain rot was not built through conscious choices. You did not sit down one day and decide to fragment your attention. You did not deliberately train your brain to need constant stimulation. It happened in the background, through thousands of small automatic behaviors that never felt like decisions. Reaching for your phone while waiting for a minute. Opening an app the moment a thought became uncomfortable. Switching to something else the second a video slowed down. These were not choices in the traditional sense. They were reflexes. And the reason they felt invisible is that the brain, over time, had moved them below the threshold of awareness. This is what neuroscientists call automaticity. When a behavior repeats enough times in consistent conditions, the brain stops bringing it to conscious attention. It becomes background, effortless, invisible. And this is precisely why willpower fails as a strategy. You cannot use conscious effort to fight a behavior that is no longer happening consciously. By the time you think about it, it is already done. The phone is already in your hand. The app is already open. The scroll has already begun. This is not weakness. This is the nature of deeply grooved automatic behavior. And it is the reason that the real solution to brain rot begins not with action but with awareness. Specifically, the awareness that brings the automatic back into the conscious. That creates the pause before the reflex fires. That reinserts you into a moment where there was no you before. Because that pause is where everything changes. Let's talk about what that awareness actually feels like and how it works. Most people assume awareness is something you either have or you don't. Either you are a mindful person who notices their habits, or you're someone swept along by them. But awareness is not a personality trait, it is a skill. And like any skill, it develops through practice. At first it is clunky. You will not catch the reflex before it happens. You will notice it during. Your phone will already be in your hand before you realize you reached for it. And that is fine. Because noticing during is still noticing. It is still a moment where the automatic has been interrupted. And in that interruption, however small, something is happening inside the brain. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for conscious decision-making, is re-entering a situation that had been handed entirely to the automatic system. And the more that happens, the more the brain begins to reassign that behavior. It starts as automatic, then it becomes semi-conscious. Then it becomes something you notice slightly earlier, then earlier still, until one day, you notice the impulse before you have acted on it. And in that moment, you have a choice that you did not have before. Not because you became more disciplined, but because awareness gave you access to a decision that previously happened without you. This is what people describe when they say they feel more in control. Not that the urge disappeared, but that they began to see it coming. And once you see something coming, everything changes. You can ask a question you could not ask before. Do I actually want to do this? Not as a moral judgment, not as a test of your willpower, just a genuine, curious question. Is this something I am choosing or something I am running on autopilot? That question, repeated over time, does something remarkable. It makes the invisible visible. It restores agency to behaviors that had quietly moved outside your control. And each time you ask it, each time you bring conscious attention to a moment that would have otherwise been automatic, you are doing the neurological equivalent of a repetition. You are using the awareness pathway. You are making it slightly stronger. You are beginning, slowly, to take your mind back. Now let's talk about channeling, because awareness alone is not the full picture. Awareness creates the pause. But what you do inside the pause determines the direction your brain moves next. And this is where most people make a mistake that keeps them stuck. They treat the goal as subtraction. Remove the bad content. Reduce the screen time. Eliminate the scroll. But the brain does not simply accept a vacuum. The hunger that was built through years of stimulation does not disappear because you remove the stimulus. It redirects, which is why people who cold turkey from their phones often find themselves restless, irritable, reaching for something, and not knowing what. The brain is still running the seeking program. It has just lost the object it was seeking. So the question is not only, what do I stop doing? The question is, where do I direct the energy that was going there? This is channeling, not suppression, not replacement in the shallow sense of swapping one app for another, but a deliberate, gradual process of redirecting the brain's seeking energy toward inputs that give it something more, something that requires more of it, something with a slower payoff, but a deeper satisfaction. And here is why this is the right frame. The brain that got hooked on fast content is not a broken brain. It is a brain that learned to seek, that learned to look for stimulation, that learned to follow curiosity, however shallow the curiosity had become. Those are not bad instincts. They are the same instincts that make people learn, explore, create, discover. The problem is not the seeking. It is what the seeking had been pointed at. And you cannot erase seeking, but you can redirect it. When you begin introducing content that moves slightly slower than what you were used to, a longer video, a podcast that develops an idea over 30 minutes, a book that takes 3 chapters to build to its insight, something interesting happens inside the brain. At first it resists. The old wiring says this is not rewarding enough. Switch to something faster. But if you stay, the brain begins to do something it had not done in a while. It engages, not passively, but with the kind of attention that actually tracks something from beginning to end. And when it reaches the payoff, when the idea lands, when the story arrives at its moment, the reward that registers is different from the dopamine hit of a scroll. It is slower. It is deeper. It lingers. And the brain, which is always learning, registers that too. Over time, with repetition, the brain begins to recalibrate. The threshold that was raised slowly begins to lower. Ordinary things begin to feel interesting again. Slowness begins to feel like richness rather than boredom. And the seeking energy that was once captured by an algorithm begins flowing toward things that actually mean something to you. This is not a miracle. It is the same mechanism that built the rot, working in the opposite direction. Let's be specific about what this looks like in practice, because this is not about a program. It is not about a list of habits. It is about understanding the principle deeply enough to apply it in your own life. The principle is this: every action points the brain in a direction, not dramatically, not permanently in a single instance, but directionally. When you pick up your phone out of habit and scroll for 20 minutes, the brain moves slightly in the direction of automatic, low-effort seeking. When you notice the impulse, pause and ask yourself whether you actually want to do this. The brain moves slightly in the direction of conscious agency. When you sit with a slow, developing piece of content, even when your attention is pulling elsewhere, the brain moves slightly in the direction of sustained focus. When you put the phone down before you meant to and let yourself experience a moment of simple, unoccupied existence, the brain moves slightly in the direction of tolerating stillness. None of these shifts are visible in real time, but they accumulate. And here is what accumulation looks like inside the brain. At the neurological level, each repeated behavior strengthens the synaptic connections associated with it. This is called long-term potentiation. The neurons that fire together begin to fire more easily together over time. The pathway becomes more efficient, more automatic, more natural. When this happens with the scrolling reflex, scrolling becomes something you do without deciding. When it begins happening with conscious attention becomes something you reach for more naturally. When it happens with the ability to sit in stillness, stillness begins to feel less threatening. The brain is always, constantly, remodeling itself based on what you repeat, which means there is no neutral action. Every single thing you do with your attention is either building or eroding something, not in a catastrophic, dramatic sense, but consistently, quietly, over time. And when you understand that, something shifts in how you experience everyday moments. The decision to read one more page before switching is not a small act. It is a vote for the brain you are building. The moment you notice a reflex before it fires is not a minor observation. It is evidence that your awareness is growing. The afternoon you felt slightly less compelled to reach for your phone is not an accident. It is your wiring beginning to shift. Each of these things matters, not as motivation, as mechanism. There is something important to address here that most conversations about this topic skip over. The fact that you were hooked once means you can be hooked again. This is not a warning to frighten you. It is a structural truth about how this works. The pathways that were built during the years of heavy consumption do not disappear. They go quiet with disuse. They lose their dominance. They stop feeling like the only option, but they remain. And this is why recovery from brain rot is not a destination you arrive at and then relax. It is a relationship you develop with your own attention, an ongoing, conscious, curious relationship. Not a battle, not a test of strength, a relationship. Think about what that actually means. A relationship with your own mind, where you notice what it is doing without immediately judging it, where you see the old reflex activate and recognize it for what it is, a pathway that was trained, not a truth about who you are, where you make a choice, imperfectly and humanly, about what direction you want to point in next, and where you understand that one bad day, one afternoon of mindless scrolling, one week where everything slipped, is not a relapse. It is information. It is the brain showing you where the old wiring is still active. And that information is useful, not as shame, as a map. Because people who understand this do not collapse when they slip. They get curious. What triggered the old pattern? What was happening in my environment, my mood, my stress level, that made the automatic pathway feel attractive again? And what does that tell me about what I actually need right now? That curiosity is the practice, not perfection, not consistency that never breaks, but the ongoing, genuine, interested attention to your own patterns. And over time, that attention itself becomes the most powerful force in your recovery, because you stop being someone who is trying to resist their own brain, and you start being someone who understands it. Let's talk about what actually begins to change, and when. Because one of the things that makes this journey feel impossible is that the early stages look like nothing. You are making micro decisions. You are pausing before reflexes. You are redirecting attention in small ways, and the brain looks exactly the same on the outside, which is why most people give up before the changes compound. But here is what is actually happening inside, even when you cannot see it. In the first days of beginning this practice, the most noticeable thing is friction, discomfort. The old pathways are still dominant, and every time you redirect away from them, the brain registers something like resistance. a pull toward the familiar, a quiet restlessness. This is not failure. This is the old wiring noticing that it is no longer being reinforced, and it is your first confirmation that something is actually shifting. Within a week of consistent, imperfect practice, something subtle begins. The moments of pause get slightly longer, not because you are trying harder, but because the space between impulse and action is beginning to widen. You start noticing things you were not noticing before. The frequency of your phone checking, the texture of your own restlessness, the specific situations that trigger the reflex most strongly. This is awareness growing, and awareness growing is the precondition for everything else. Within a few weeks, the channeling begins to take hold. Things you redirected toward start feeling slightly more natural. The slow content that felt like an effort in the first days starts feeling like less of one. Not because you lowered your standards, but because your brain's threshold is beginning to come down. The ordinary is starting to register again. A thought that you follow all the way to its conclusion feels like something. A moment of genuine stillness, however brief, feels like relief rather than emptiness. These are not dramatic transformations, but they are real, and they are the first evidence that the wiring is genuinely changing. Over months, the person who does this consistently reports something they did not expect. They do not feel like they have more discipline. They feel like they have more of themselves back. The version of them that could sit with an idea, that could feel genuine curiosity without it being immediately satisfied, that could be bored for a moment and let the boredom become something interesting rather than something to escape. That version was not lost. It was buried under the noise. And as the noise quiets, through awareness, through channeling, through repetition in the right direction, it begins to surface again. There is a moment that people who go through this process describe. It is hard to pinpoint exactly when it happens, but at some point they realize that something has quietly changed. They are sitting somewhere, not doing anything in particular, and they do not feel the pull, not because they fought it, not because they white-knuckled their way through the moment, but because in that moment, the pull simply wasn't as strong as it used to be. And that is a different feeling from discipline. Discipline is effortful. It requires constant energy. It is always fighting something. But this feeling is something else. It is the absence of a fight. It is the brain settling into a different baseline, one where the constant seeking has softened, where the restlessness that needed to be satisfied every few minutes has become something more spacious, where sitting in a moment without immediate input feels okay, sometimes better than okay. This is what the healing of brain rot actually feels like. Not a dramatic transformation, not suddenly becoming someone who meditates for an hour every morning and never feels distracted, but a quiet, gradual return to something that was always there. The ability to be present, the ability to think in a direction, the ability to want something and feel that wanting, rather than immediately distracting yourself away from it. These are not small things. They are the foundation of a life that feels like yours. So let us bring this all together, because this has been a long conversation, and what matters is not the concepts in isolation. What matters is what you take from it, that changes how you move through your day. Brain rot is not a content problem. It is not a willpower problem. It is not evidence that something is fundamentally wrong with you. It is what happens when a brain, built to adapt, adapts to an environment that was designed to capture it. It is the result of thousands of repeated micro-behaviors that quietly moved below the threshold of consciousness. It is wiring that was built, which means it is wiring that can be redirected. Digital detox helps, but it is incomplete. Because the wiring remains, And without changing your relationship to that wiring, the same environment will call the same pathways back into dominance. Cold turkey can buy you clarity in the short term, but the long-term strategy has to be something different. Something that works inside the reality of a life, where the phone is both the problem and the tool. That strategy begins with awareness. Not the awareness of a monk, but the ordinary, imperfect awareness of someone who begins noticing what they are doing, just slightly, before they were noticing it yesterday. It continues with channeling, deliberately, gradually redirecting the brain's seeking energy toward inputs that require more of it. Not as punishment, not as a joyless exercise, but as a recognition that the hunger the brain developed can be fed something better. It deepens through repetition. Every micro-decision matters, not in a dramatic, life-defining sense, but in the quiet, cumulative, mechanistic sense. The brain is always learning from what you repeat, which means you are always, in every small moment, either reinforcing the old wiring or beginning to build something new. And it sustains through a conscious, ongoing relationship with your own attention. Not a battle, not a test, a relationship, where you stay curious about your patterns, where you treat a bad day as information rather than failure, where you understand that you can be hooked again, not because you are weak, but because the pathway remains, and you remain responsible for the direction you pointed. This is not a program. It is not a 30-day challenge. It is a different way of relating to your own mind. And once you begin relating to it this way, something that previously felt like a permanent condition begins to feel like a direction you are choosing. Not fixed, but moving. Not hopeless, but in motion. People ask how long this takes, and the honest answer is, it depends on what you mean. If you mean when do the first shifts become visible, the answer is sooner than most people expect. Within a week of genuine, consistent practice, of awareness and redirection, most people notice something. Not a transformation, but a signal. A moment where they caught themselves before the automatic behavior completed. A moment where something slow held their attention a little longer than it would have yesterday. A moment where the restlessness was slightly less loud than it has been. Those signals are not small. They are the first evidence of a brain beginning to move in a new direction. If you mean, when does it feel natural? When does the new wiring start to feel like home? That takes longer. Weeks. Months in some cases. Depending on how long the old patterns had been running. Depending on how embedded the automatic behaviors had become. But the direction of change is reliable. Because the mechanism is reliable. Repetition in a direction changes the brain. That is not a theory. That is how the brain works. And the most important thing you can take from this is not a strategy. It is a reframe. Every moment is now evidence. Every moment where you notice a reflex is a moment where your awareness grew. Every moment where you redirect is a moment where the new wiring was used. Every moment where you ask yourself whether you are choosing or running on autopilot is a moment where you reclaimed a decision that had quietly slipped out of your hands. Those moments are not stepping stones to some distant goal. They are the goal. They are the thing. Because a life where you are present in your own moments, where your attention belongs to you, where your mind can follow a thought all the way to where it leads, is not a life that begins someday in the future, when the brain rot is completely healed. It is a life that begins the moment you start relating to your attention differently. And that moment is available to you now. Not when the apps are deleted, not when the discipline is finally in place, not when you have completely figured this out. Now, in this moment. which is where the brain always is, and where you, for perhaps the first time in a while, are choosing to be as well. If something in this video made you uncomfortable, made you pause, made you recognize parts of yourself you normally scroll past, pay attention to that. Not because you need to fix everything tonight, but because the part of your brain that is still capable of sitting with a long, slow developing idea just did exactly that. For however long this took, it stayed, it followed, it arrived here. That is not nothing. That is the part of you that was never actually gone. If this made sense to you, you already know why you're here. We'll talk again.